So let me tell you a little bit about Ryan. He is a co-founder and assistant professor of psychology at San Francisco State University. His personality and well-being lab aims to better understand the role of finances and consumption in people's happiness and subjective well-being, as well as the concept of happiness and quality of life in general. Ryan also runs a consumer research website called beyondthepurchase.org. I'm sorry. Without further ado, welcome Dr. Howell.
Thank you very much, Sky. I want to start by saying it's definitely an honor to be here, to have an opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the survey that we developed. It really was a collaborative effort, many phone calls, lots of discussion about item selection, and I'll try the best I can to make psychometrics fun. Anyone else a psychometrician in here? All right, you and we're gonna love this. A couple of things I want to sort of talk a little bit about. I forgot I should have like an introductory slide a little bit about myself. So I consider myself really a positive consumer psychologist would be the sort of easiest way to think about what I do, trying to look at what we spend our money on and what will ultimately make us happy. I liked the idea mentioned earlier about sort of getting involved in a way in which you feel your strengths. That's something that was brought home to me in my liberal arts education. And so what I'm good at is measuring things. So that's sort of how I got involved. I do run a website, beyondthepurchase.org. One of the things that I would definitely advocate is that there are lots of places out there where people are collecting data, NEF, HI, GNHI, USA, Beyond the Purchase. And if you run across one of these websites, I really hope that you'll take some time to answer some of the questions on there, because it really helps us begin to understand a little bit about what we're trying to measure. So I just implore you, again, take surveys. They help. One of the things I'm going to sort of end with, and I want to sort of bring it up right here in the beginning to make sure, because I don't think I did a good job of this in the slides, is that one of the things we really need to begin to discuss in this conference is a little bit about sort of what types of well-being we value, or what are sort of our beliefs in well-being, and that we're beginning to see that different people from different walks of life really value different aspects of happiness. And I think that's one of the big messages you'll see here, is that happiness isn't really a singular construct. It's multiple constructs sort of pulled together at the same time, and that you may really want different parts of happiness out of your life. And with that in mind, I hope you all have a piece of paper and a pen somewhere. You should, because you should be taking wonderful notes. Just take a couple of seconds really quick and write down in just a sentence your definition of happiness. The other way to think about that is, if you were happier tomorrow than you are today, what would be different in your life? So just think about that for a second. How do you define happiness? I think I see some of you beginning to finish that, and thank you for partaking in that. I guess the easiest way to sort of think about this in the beginning, and what we started to do with the survey, is say that happiness is lots of different types of things. This is definitely the Bhutanese model of sort of what happiness is, or what subjective well-being is. And I want to sort of point out the importance of measuring all these different types of constructs, and I'll try and go quickly through sort of how we got here, because if you have taken the survey, you may ask yourself, how did those items come to be? So the first part is that there's essentially 10 major types of domains of well-being you might think of. Psychological well-being, which could also be called flourishing if you want to think of it from the literature. Self-reported physical health, time balance, community vitality, social connectedness, access to education and culture, environmental quality, or the feeling that your environment is nice around you, a process in the democratic process, material well-being, and work experience. Next slide. And so where we started, or where my lab started in particular, is there's a lot of people that are trying to measure a lot of these different types of constructs. And so we just started generating a list of different organizations and different places where at least one of those constructs is being measured. And you can see that there's tons of places out there. Actually, one of the best, if you can actually get a hold of it, it's pretty easy, but you sometimes have to search through Google for a little bit, is the Detroit Area Survey from 2001. They do actually a really interesting job of measuring, probably closer to quality of place instead of sort of well-being. And so basically what we did is we sort of read through these and we said, okay, so which are the items that are measuring psychological well-being as based on the definition definitions that have been provided both by Bhutan and at the time HI. And many of you may remember this because John and Laura were basically begging you to take this really, really long, hour-long survey, and most of you complained about it, and you probably should have because it was very long. It was 450 items, and there were at least 500 people who volunteered their time because, as Laura said, we didn't exactly have any money. So we were able to get tons of people to begin to answer these questions, and we basically began to select items that are most representative of that construct. And so real quickly, not to bore you too much with the psychometrics, they have to have high factor loadings, which means they're just correlated with the construct that we're interested in, and they have to basically be correlated with the operational definitions that we're using to define the constructs. And so from that, we could actually cull down from the 450 to just a mere 150 items. But John and Laura said that you have to make it fewer items than that, so then what we did is we said, okay, well, we need to get from 150 items down to something that's a little bit more manageable, because even 150 items is quite often too many. So we put it up on MTurk, and then we started using different types of validity measures where we're correlating it again with the operational definition. We're looking at the psychometric properties. Next slide. And we were able to actually get it down. I wanted to get it to each construct being just 5 items. Unfortunately, some of these constructs are very diffuse, specifically like social connectedness is not something that's as easy to measure with just a few items. Other things actually you probably could measure with fewer than 5 items. And we got it down to about 5 to 7 items. And it wasn't just that we were using psychometric properties, and this is where some of the conversations came in. So they wanted to make sure that the breadth of the domain was actually being measured well, and that we could actually begin to understand, are we really getting what we consider to be time balance? Are really getting all the facets of social connectedness? Also, something that was brought up a lot in my lab is to make sure that the face validity or the readability of the items made sense to individuals. And so all of this went into reducing it down from 150 items down to about 65 total items. Next slide. And so again, we were able to put it up online. We did this twice. Again, by the way, Mechanical Turk is a great place to go make very little amounts of money doing boring things. People take surveys on there for us, which is very nice. So we were able to get this really nice short measure that we were able to then pay a little bit more money for and get it about 570 individuals from the US who are representative geographically, age, gender, political affiliation, across the board. They're pretty much representing the United States. It's not really a random sample, though we can talk about this later. I don't really think there are any more realistic random samples because most people won't pick up the phone and talk to the Pew Research Center anymore. But we did get something that was very, very representative of the United States. And so here's really the point that I want to make. I mean, John asked me to give some of the highlights of the survey. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about why is it so important to measure more than just one construct of well-being. Well, if you think back to the video we just saw, one of the things that you consistently hear is that Denmark is the happiest country in the world. And that's true if you look at the single measure that they're using to measure happiness, which is Cantrell's ladder. Basically, where are you on the ladder of life? You start to use other measures, other countries move up, other countries move down. And so it really depends on sort of what you're looking at. And so what I noticed was that there are a couple of things that we wanted to be able to look at, and I wanted to show you a couple of things that I think are really interesting about this survey. So the next slide. The first is, and this is a really messy slide, I probably won't spend a ton of time on it. One of the things that we can do actually is begin to make sure that we have items that are used on the same response scale, and that allows us to begin to rank order what people say they're most and least satisfied with. And you can begin to see some of these types of things make sense. A little bit surprising to me, to be quite honest with you, but this probably has to do more with your local area. Most people are actually really satisfied with the environmental quality of their neighborhood. The least satisfied were the transparency of their local government. That was where their least satisfied were. They're also not very satisfied with their financial situation, their work situation, their physical health, their leisure time, etc. And so one of the things that we can begin to do is we can begin to sort of rank order. We can see that there are places where there are deficiencies and there are places where we're sort of doing well. And so that's one thing that we can do when we take a more holistic approach to happiness, is not just say that who's happy and who's not, but really begin to see a sort of profile of well-being. You know, where are certain communities most deficient and where are they excelling? So that's one of the major reasons to have more than just one domain. Next slide. Here's something that I found, literally this is from the plane today. when I was flying up here. John mentioned this, I shouldn't call this, should be like age and well-being would have been a better way to describe this. So subjective well-being, these are the 3 items that are typically used when you hear about those national rankings. So these are the ladder questions, basically. And what you notice is that age and subjective well-being in this data set are not related. Age is also not related to psychological well-being or physical health or social connected or governance. So you might begin to think, well, age has nothing to do with well-being. Next slide. It does, because there's a huge difference in age and time balance. There's a difference in age and community vitality, access to education, quality of place, environmental quality, and material well-being. And I'll go through these next slides relatively quickly, just because they sort of show a picture that I think is sort of interesting. So here are actually the graphs. So this is time balance. Basically, the least time balanced people are between the age of 38 and 42. So basically, you're doing good in college, you hit your bottom, I guess you decide you don't want to be a workaholic, and you go up. By the way, if you're not 73, all right, if you're younger than 73, as YouTube says, it gets better, okay? Because all of these show the same type of thing. These individuals, as they aged, things went up. Next slide. But one of the things you'll also notice is that the pattern's not always the same. So here we see I know that you can sort of like, draw a line right there. It's really a sort of flat line until about 38 on community vitality. So people don't feel as connected with their communities until they get to about their mid-40s, and then it takes off. Next slide. Same type of thing here. This is cultural access. So basically, you really see that the under 22 group is really driving the drop there. It's just a nice linear effect that's going up. So people feel like that they're getting more access. Maybe they're getting more involved in their groups. Next slide, next slide, next slide. And so what you're seeing is that these patterns are different. And so there's 2 things I really want to point out here. One is that it's important to measure well-being because if you had just used the measure that is typically used to indicate rankings at a national level, you would have said there's no relationship between age and happiness. But we see that there is one. It just depends on how you're measuring it. Next one. This was sort of interesting. I just wanted to pull this off because I know I've heard this a lot, and a lot of my data doesn't back this up, so we wanted to try something a little bit different. Political groups and subjective well-being. You may hear that conservatives are actually happier with their lives than liberals. I think that actually is a really, really small effect and is bloated because we have a lot of people in there. But here was what was actually interesting, is that political groups was not related, again, with subjective well-being, the typical single measure that's used, or a whole host of other things. But it was related with a couple of things. It was related with psychological well-being, which is a little bit different, time balance. Oh, and I'm sure John will like this. Time balance is the big, that's always related with everything, all right? So be balanced in time. Time balance, community vitality, social connection, and access to education. Here's another example of where if you begin to look at a diversity of different types of definitions, you begin to see different types of pictures unfold. So next slide. And the first one is, so it's conservative on the left, moderate in the middle, liberal on the right. This is the sort of pattern that we've come to expect. So psychological well-being, conservatives say they're flourishing more than moderates or liberals, but next slide. Now we actually see the opposite on time balance. Liberals say they have the most time balance compared to the other 2 groups. Next slide. Now we actually see this really weird sort of thing with moderates being really the only group that doesn't feel like they're thriving in their communities. Next slide. And same type of thing with social connectedness. And so one of the things that I really want to sort of drive home in this time is that we spent, like hundreds of hours, all of us, trying to figure out what is sort of the best, I think it's roughly about 65 questions to measure well-being. And the big point about that is that you need that much information so that you can begin to see these nice nuanced descriptions. Because if you're going to look at a community or a city or you're going to look at a nation, you really need a profile of well-being. You really need to be able to look at that because in some areas, people are going to be thriving. In some areas, they're not. And in some areas, there's going to be relationships with demographic variables. In some areas, they're not. And that's why I actually wanted you to write down your definitions of happiness. So how am I doing on time, by the way?